Hey, welcome to our chat today. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that's a bit rough, a bit tough, but we need to address it because we experience it up close. We live it ourselves, which is the issue of corruption. We all dream of a world without corruption, where everything runs smoothly and honestly. But a lot of times we don't see how much it's infiltrated into our own lives. It's a common thing to talk about this, but it's important for us to take a serious look at it, a reflection aimed at transformation. We must challenge ourselves to create something new for the future. This is healthy. This is necessary. May our future be filled with dreams. May them be filled with improvement, with becoming a useful human being for ourselves and for the world. In other words, let's be a positive influence, a factor of improvement, so that the world becomes a little better because of this healthy cell that is us. So let's talk about this once again. Let's tackle the topic of corruption, which I know is already widely discussed in society, but from a slightly more philosophical point of view. The first thing I'd like to point out is the following. Awareness about these corruption processes can't just be imposed through punishment, but should involve everyone in a culture of responsibility. And it's about this culture of responsibility that I'd like to talk. One thing that's crucial to start with, which we mentioned when talking about ethics, but it's important to reiterate here, is that an ethics that doesn't get corrupted has to be an ethics of conviction, not of coercion. Well, even though there needs to be a sort of punitive aspect right now, because otherwise we lose control of humanity, we should have a vision of improvement for the future where more and more people move from an ethics of coercion towards a much better ethics of conviction. Do you remember a story I told you once about two very different foods we used to eat as kids? One of them was bitter melon and the other was chocolate. I was pointing out to you that when we ate the bitter melon, we did it under threat or with the promise of a reward. Eat up, little one, or you won't get to watch TV. Eat, because if you do, you'll get dessert. So we didn't eat the bitter melon for its own sake. It was for the reward, or to avoid punishment. Pain or pleasure. This line of pain or pleasure, fear or desire, reward or punishment, is the line of animal consciousness. It's a horizontal line that makes us incredibly manipulated. Because if we only move in that way, the person who has what I desire or what I fear in their hands is going to, as we say, make a fool out of me. They'll have control over my behavior. So it's an action that traps you. It's an action that limits you. And we can realize that often ethics goes down this path. Either I'm going to be recognized as the model employee, or I'm going to get punished for something by some supervisor or someone who witnessed my action and will report me, and I'll face the consequences. Now, when it comes to chocolate, our mom didn't need to threaten or promise anything. As soon as she said, "Hey, want some chocolate?" Before she even finished the sentence, we were already diving in, already eating. Why? There was no need for a reward, punishment, pain, or pleasure. Because we like chocolate for its own sake, for what it is, and not for what we're going to gain or avoid losing later. It's not for anything that comes after. We eat it for its own sake, because we like it. And then you realize we have two types of ethics. On one hand, we have the ethics of bitter melon, and on the other, the ethics of chocolate. Why do I practice the bitter ethics? Out of fear or for the desire of some reward. Either I'm going to be punished or I'm going to be rewarded or recognized. And the sweet ethics we do because we love ethics, because we find fulfillment in doing it, because we see ourselves as much more human. We feel much more at peace with our conscience, in tune with our human nature when we do it. So it's a feeling of well-being that nothing compares to. Then we're no longer on the horizontal axis of animal consciousness. We enter the vertical axis of human consciousness, the one that doesn't act out of pain or pleasure, but out of duty. Not duty as an obligation, nor as something forced, but duty as a sense of responsibility we have towards life. I must be human. Nature expects that from me. So we do it for the ethics itself and not for anything that comes after. This observation is important because we can't believe that an ethics of coercion is going to change the world. It's not going to banish corruption. Because the ethics of coercion works as long as there's surveillance, as long as someone is watching. It's like we say, it would be a kind of ethics just for show. In other words, if there's no one watching, that thin mask, that thin layer, it falls to the ground, and we show the same barbarity we've always had. I tell you that I've already seen this happen in 2 big cities around the world. A moment when there's a blackout and people who are middle class, upper middle class, really well-dressed people, they start breaking windows and stealing things. Why? Because no one was watching them. But an infrared camera was filming them, and they didn't know it. In other words, when that visibility drops, the barbarity comes to the surface. In other words, corruption wasn't transformed, it was just disguised. We don't change the world that way. If we don't learn to understand ethics and integrate it as a way of life that I would have, even if I were Robinson Crusoe, living alone on an island, then I'm not truly ethical. So it's important for us to reflect on this. That's the kind of ethics that changes the world. Plato has an example, which I've also shared with you in other talks, that he gives in the book The Republic and his dialogue The Republic, which is the myth of the ring of Gyges. To sum it up, he says that Gyges was a shepherd from Lydia, considered very honest, and one day he finds a ring with a stone that, when turned inside his hand, made him invisible. After testing it a lot, he realizes it's true and starts, while invisible, sneaking into people's houses, stealing, harassing women, basically doing everything wrong he could do. And when he becomes visible again, he goes back to being the nice Gyges that everyone believed in and admired. So, is Gyges honest or not? Is he ethical or not? It's clear that we don't have an ethical person here. We have a behavior of appearances to avoid falling under the power of any punishment. But going further, Plato takes this example even further. He says to imagine the opposite situation, where Gyges, while invisible, was just as ethical and honest as he was when visible. And if the people in his community knew about it. In public, what would they say to each other? Wow, how admirable Gyges is! What a wonderful person! Why? They'd be afraid he might cause them harm. But when they got home and the door closed behind them, they'd say, what an idiot that Gyges is, right? What a fool! If that ring fell into my hands, I'd make the most of it. And Plato concludes by saying that people don't really love ethics. They don't really love honesty. They make a kind of social pact, where I don't steal from you, so you don't steal from me. Because what if you're stronger or smarter than me? I'd end up losing out. So we make a pact where we don't steal from each other, so we can have some relative harmony in society. But there are Gyges rings that sometimes make us invisible, and that mask falls off. Like, for example, our thoughts. What we think, no one can see, so we're not always ethical in our thoughts. We're not always honest in our thoughts. And we know that what we think today will become reality in our lives tomorrow. Because everything starts in the mental plane, like it says in the Kybalion. And another situation that's often like the ring of Gyges is power. In general, even those who say if you want to know who a person really is, give them power. Some people talk about it in that sense. I don't really believe in that. I believe there are people who behave that way and others who don't. But anyway, it's a big temptation. To be like the ring of Gyges, power gives you a certain invisibility, meaning no punishment can touch me. So I feel like I can get away with doing whatever I want. One of the things we do the most these days is implementing training within companies, within organizations, and monitoring to prevent corruption from happening. I believe that at this point there's nothing more to be done. If we stop watching and stop punishing, we turn into chaos because we don't have that level of consciousness in humanity right now. However, I think there comes a certain point where it can't just be that. We have to go beyond that. I'll bring up again for you that quote from Francis Bacon, which I really like when he talks about hope. He says, "Hope is a good breakfast, but a bad supper." What does he mean by that? That at lunchtime, which is youth, when we're still young and stepping into life, it's good to have hope. But at dinner time, which is maturity, you can't just be waiting around for anything anymore. You should have already gotten up and done something. I think his point is really smart. And we can say the same thing here. Well, then, surveillance, coercion is a good breakfast, but by dinner time you need to have awareness. Coercion, social pact, is fine for breakfast. By dinner time, we need to have social awareness. Because if we don't, we'll never change humanity. And we know there will always be a crack where surveillance doesn't reach. There will always be a crack where training doesn't convince. Especially because we're generally very theoretical in these trainings. We don't get down to practical life and individual responsibility for each person. I always mention in my talks a quote attributed to Cicero, which I find quite interesting. He says that a bad speaker is someone who everyone leaves the speech or lecture thinking about him. Wow, how cultured, how good. And that a good speaker is someone who everyone leaves the talk thinking about themselves. I find it really interesting what he says, because it shows that a speech has to be practical and get into the lives of the people who hear it. And show how corruption harms them as individuals, how the lack of ethics harms them. And not just show an institutional facade or something a bit more intellectual. That doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of a person's life and isn't transformative. And our trainings aren't always that practical. So, surveillance has its limits, and training, depending on how it's done, also has its limits. So, we need an education process where, from a very young age, we teach people the value of ethics. How this fulfills, how it brings satisfaction, how it gives us well-being. In such a way that people love ethics as something desirable, something that gives them a good dose of pleasure. Another kind of pleasure, the pleasures of the soul, a good dose of satisfaction, of peace of mind. This has to be desired for its own sake. We should educate from childhood so that kids love values, so they see how it transforms their lives, how everything becomes more beautiful, how everything becomes more pleasant. In other words, work with kids in this way. Continuing, a society that has a pact with ethics in their personal lives can use official channels to demand seriousness from the government. You know why? Because it has the moral authority to do so. If you have a society where everyone is ethical, where there's no corruption, that society has the strength to demand that kind of behavior from those who govern it. In front of the institutions that are in power. It can confront these institutions and say, "I demand that you be ethical because it is." Until we have that solidity, we don't have the moral authority to be more vigilant and demanding of those who lead our civilizational process. We need to be in that state of solidity and integrity, which gives us the chance to take part in this process of holding others accountable. We've got a bunch of public agencies to keep an eye on other public agencies, but no matter how well the job is done, it's not enough. We need society to be part of this work, to watch over and curb corruption. Only then does it have a chance to work. It's important for us to understand something called responses given to the I am. Because that's going to make a big difference in the process of getting rid of corruption. So it's that exercise I often talk about, of taking your consciousness and bringing it to the last day of your life. An imagination exercise. Don't be afraid to do it, just do it. Picture yourself on the last day of your life. What kind of human being do you want to be? Because that's the masterpiece of your life as a whole. What qualities do you want to have achieved? What flaws do you want to have smoothed out? What path, what mark do you want to have left in the world? What do you want to have done for others, for yourself? In other words, who do you want to be at that point? At that moment, you are the masterpiece of your life. You need to visualize it in great detail. And, if possible, even write it down so you don't forget. The human being I want to be. the human being at the end of my path. And that all your actions day by day, from now on, honor that human being. Walk towards that human being. It's no use knowing there's an ethical human being if we don't bring that into our lives. It doesn't work if we don't put ourselves in direct relation to it. There's a story that says there was a man who didn't like the sun. So he would close all the windows and doors of his house because he didn't like the sun. One day he realized that was crazy and decided to make peace with the sun. He opened the doors and windows. The distance he was from the sun, whether the doors and windows were closed or open, is exactly the same. But just his decision to put himself in contact with the sun already allows the sun to touch him where he is, to illuminate him where he is. Just by deciding to open the windows of consciousness and put yourself in contact with it. So, when you open the windows of your consciousness and say, I want to be this human being, the virtues of that human being will already be, in some way, at some level with you now. And you take this as a reference for your life. And then you'll be able to see if there's anything in the world worth abandoning this path of building yourself. Then you can observe and weigh values and see if there's anything in your life more valuable than that. If we don't have a reference point, a sense of purpose in life, we often end up not knowing how to weigh what's more or less important in our lives. And this can leave us very disoriented and with very questionable choices. When we break this pact we've made with ourselves, meaning with that self I want to be, that I love, that I deeply wish to be, when I break this pact, I lose trust in myself and respect for myself. These two things, self-confidence and self-respect, make up a wonderful virtue called dignity. I respect myself, I trust myself, I got my own back. I am a human being deeply committed to the noble, just, and good ideal, the ideal of a complete human being. When we lose confidence in ourselves, it's one of the hardest things to get back. You lose someone's trust, you make a commitment and don't show up. That person can always count on someone else, they're not that dependent on you. Now, you always need to count on yourself. If you lose confidence in yourself, you lose the foundation to support yourself and launch into the future. You end up without a foundation to make that leap towards the future. Every time you say, I'm going to do this or that, your own conscience says, here you go again with that nonsense. You never honor the things you want and you won't have a foundation, you won't have support. Losing confidence in yourself is serious and hard to get back. It's a pretty long and tough road to regain that confidence. We always have a tug-of-war within society. Even if I have all these values within me, meaning that I'm true to my sense of purpose, that I have attitudes, beliefs, and values that are completely aligned with this ideal, I have around me an environment, a pressure from workplaces, pressure from society, that often works against this. We're living in a historical moment where corruption has become commonplace. So, the little everyday corruptions, people see them and don't give them much thought. They think there's nothing wrong with it. They're extremely tolerant of it. They disregard it. In other words, we've made corruption a common part of life. And a lot of times, we even encourage ourselves and others to commit it. So, there's this pressure sometimes from society for you not to be a fool, not to miss opportunities, to take advantage of chances to get ahead in life. This pressure is a tug-of-war with what you hold inside. Now, you have to strengthen those principles you hold inside every day, so you can win this tug-of-war. Because if the world beats you with its distractions, you can't do anything, not for yourself, not for the world. The first thing you gotta do is make sure your values beat the external pressure. Your values have to bring down the external pressure. In this tug-of-war, they have to win. In such a way that now you've really overcome the pressures of the world. And now you can do something to improve it. Can you give an example, some reference that could improve it? That's how we start making history. Because before that, we were just surviving. A human being who honors their identity, their ideal, and doesn't let themselves be corrupted, because that's the worst kind of corruption and the first kind of corruption. That person is an example of a different way of living. And an example in a historical moment where they're so rare has a huge impact. It's like a stone we throw into the water, creating bigger and bigger ripples. We're in a really dark time, morally speaking. Someone with a little light can be seen from far away. So, we have a huge responsibility for the example we set for society, for better or for worse. Indian tradition says something that's a bit scary, actually. You guys have probably heard about the idea of karma. Karma is a law that every time you stray from the straight path, the honest path, the path of your ideal, which they call dharma, every time you stray, you're going to have a painful event that pushes you back. In other words, a karmic action will cause pain to bring you back. And what do the Indians say about that? When you stray from the straight path, you're going to have to suffer some pain to get back. But when someone is inspired by your example, you also share in that person's karma. No matter how many people you influence for the worse, those people will have to suffer for the acts they committed, and you'll suffer along with them. Because you were the influencer and, therefore, a co-author of that action. For every person who gets inspired by you and has to suffer because of it. I think that's pretty scary and something we should really take into account. And sometimes, those people are our kids. They're the people we love the most, who, in some way, will always be inspired by us. It's really important for us to think about this. Predict the risk of corruption in a reactive and immediate way. It's not for you to arrive. That's the ideal. I know we still have a way to go to get there. It's not for us to get there and see a corrupt action and say, really, is it really not worth it? I don't think so. That means you haven't yet incorporated ethics intrinsically, like it's part of your own being. Because otherwise, you create a reflection. The moment it comes up, you reject it immediately. I usually give an example. You guys might remember this. I ask you to imagine a bug on your arm. And that bug is a cockroach, a big, flying one. You look at it and say, I'll get rid of it in a bit. No, there's even a word for that, right? And you throw the cockroach far away. In other words, when we see something that tempts us towards corruption, the reaction has to be like that, immediate, because you can't compare the harm a cockroach can do to you with the harm an act of corruption can cause. It's a whole different level, a different scale, there's no comparison. So, our reaction is immediate. Not that. We don't think about it anymore. We don't talk about it anymore. When we have this kind of thing as a reflex, almost like an instinct of the soul, you'll see that we've managed to overcome corruption. Don't engage with it. It's a no and that's it. The moment it calls you for a dialogue, it already has the chance to sway you, to defeat you. You're still not sure. Should I tolerate small actions from myself or people close to me? Of course, we can't suddenly start preaching morals to everyone who comes our way. There has to be room for you to talk to that person. But if you have some space, if it's a friend, a relative, not to give a moral lecture, because nobody can stand that, nobody likes a moral lesson, but to have a small conversation where you show them that, even though it seems like they gained something, they actually lost, it's worth doing. It's interesting that we can pass this reflection forward, and not just tolerate and pretend I didn't see it. I can help this person grow a bit, make them reflect on this action. Once I know, I have a certain commitment to pass this knowledge on. So, as long as you have the opportunity, you can give the lesson through a dialogue, in a very calm way, showing that with this kind of attitude, the loss is much greater than the gain. We can and should do this, indeed, in such a way that, wherever we go, people at least stop and think twice about it. An army, folks, trains in times of peace, not just in times of war. An army that goes to war and only trains at the last minute is doomed to fail from the start. There's no chance at all. What makes a powerful army? In times of peace, it's always training. In other words, when war comes, it's ready. The same thing goes for corruption. We train every day in the little things. In the details of life, we train. So when a bigger temptation comes along, you've got your moral strength built up. You've got all your war techniques ready. And you can say no right away. Because in the little things, you've been training. So this day-to-day is extremely important. That's where our moral concessions are born. And if they are born, they will grow. Like everything that is born tends to grow. So we can't let them be born at any point. It's in times of peace that we train for war. There's a teaching that I find really interesting, which is Kant's categorical imperative. Kant was a philosopher who said something really interesting about this categorical imperative. Always act in such a way that the maxim of your action can be elevated to a universal law. Imagine I don't know, you got the wrong change, and it's more than you should have. Then you say, oh no, let's pretend I didn't see it, let me take this home. For this scene, elevate that to a universal law. Everyone who got something that doesn't belong to them has the right to pretend they didn't see it and not give it back. Does that, as a universal law, make humanity a better or worse place? Obviously, it makes it worse. Everyone loses trust in everyone else. It will create a state of conflict, of tension, greater than what we have. So, that's harmful to humanity. I shouldn't be doing it. If it can't be turned into a universal law, don't give yourself the benefit of the exception. No, what I'm doing in front of humanity would be a commendable act, something everyone could copy, and it would be interesting, it would be beneficial for humanity. If not, it's not moral, don't do it. Use that as a reference. I'm here doing something, would it be good if everyone did this? No, then don't do it. That's a good tool to judge whether our actions are moral or not. Surveillance and punishment are useless if our conscience isn't watching over us. It's no use, because like I told you, there will come a time when there will be loopholes. Or who knows if that surveillance might make a deal with you at some point and both get corrupted. There will always be opportunities to bring this down. This isn't a safe method for us to practice forever. At this point, go ahead, but we need to improve these methods of ours, which is to have an internal surveillance, which is our own conscience. I'll tell you again a well-known story because I've told it many times. It's that story about the Zen monastery. To sum it up, there was a Zen monastery that was kind of falling apart. The monks there didn't have any resources. They were really poor monks, and they had no way to renovate the monastery. Then the disciples go to the master and ask, "Master, our monastery is falling apart. What do we do?" The master decides to give them a test. And he said, "It's true, the monastery is falling apart, but we don't have any resources. So I have an idea. You guys go to the nearest village and steal as much as you can. But on one condition, that no one sees you. Because it's the monastery's reputation that's at stake, a centuries-old reputation. So steal, because then we can sell it in another village and get the resources to renovate the monastery." The young ones were really conflicted at first, but then the master insisted, "Let's go," and they went to steal. When he enters the monastery, he finds a young man who kept doing his chores just the same. And then he asks, "Hey young man, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm doing what you told me to, but what do you mean doing what I told you? If all the brave ones went to the city to steal." "No, but you didn't say that. You said I shouldn't steal if someone was watching me." "That my conscience is always watching me. How can I steal?" And he was the only one who understood the test. We are always in front of our conscience. If we don't respect it, if we don't give it trust, if we don't give it dignity, it means we can't respect, trust, or give dignity to anyone outside. Because that's where our trust, our respect, our dignity are born. If we don't see our conscience as something we need to preserve, as something divine within us that we must protect, because that's our duty, it's the highest thing we have. Therefore, we have to protect it like it's in a glass case. In front of it, we can't fall into indignity. If we don't do that, there's no control over what we do outside. Because the first respect is the respect you practice with yourself. And then that spills over into social relationships. It's really important for us to think of this tale as a reference. You're always facing your conscience. Anything you want at any cost is always too expensive. Think about that. No matter how much you want something, or have dreamed about it since childhood, depending on the price it demands from you to get it, it's not worth it. Don't go down that road, it's not worth it. Anything that costs you your dignity to obtain isn't worth it, it's too big of a loss. You lose respect in front of your own divine conscience, in front of your own divine self. It's not worth it. There's a story, which I believe is more of a fable than a real story, because I've never seen a serious citation of it as a historical fact, but it talks about the Incas. It says that the Incas were fought by the Spaniards of Francisco Pizarro during the time of the invasion of the Americas, and the Spaniards waged dirty war. They were a much smaller group, much smaller, there was no comparison, but they waged dirty war. When the Incas went out to battle, which was a whole ceremonial affair, the Spaniards would attack the cities, killing women, children, and the elderly to break the warriors' spirits. Or they'd attack the crops to cause hunger, destroying everything. Or they'd wait for the army to set up camp and attack from behind in the middle of the night. Things that were dishonorable to the Incas. And that's what they did. And that's how they kept winning, winning, winning. Until a certain point, when the Incas of the Resistance, a small group of Incas who survived with their emperor, took refuge in a citadel called Vilcabamba. And they stayed there trying to wage guerrilla warfare, trying to drive out the people, the Spaniards. And then Pizarro supposedly sent an ambassador there to talk to them, with their leader, who was the Sapa Inca, the emperor. And this ambassador supposedly tried to negotiate a surrender and got nowhere. Well, since I'm here, let me ask you a question. The first time we fought you in a different way, it was a surprise. Second time, okay. But the third, fourth, 10th, 20th, 30th time, why didn't you start doing the same thing to us? Why didn't you use our methods against us? Why did you let yourselves be defeated like that? And this Inca leader supposedly said to him, "We, Incas, only want the land to stand on it. To crawl on the earth, we prefer to leave that to you." I think this story, true or not, is beautiful, just beautiful. Anything that you have to crawl to get is too expensive, don't pay for it. We can't reach the end of our lives crawling. We are men, not larvae. We can't reach the end of our lives crawling. We have to arrive standing, with dignity, in the way that's fitting for a man. So, don't do anything that requires you to crawl. Everything you have to get it standing. In other words, that's a very fitting image for dignity. And so we know how to have a hierarchy of values, of what's worth it and what's not. Like I told you, besides the personal damage, this spreads through example. We know that, for example, teenagers really need role models. Kids dream about fairy tales, teenagers want to live those tales, they want to be the hero, they want to have adventures, and they really need role models. He's able to admire people who are inspiring to him. If they don't find a role model to admire in their own parents, they'll look for that role model in society, and sometimes they find it in pretty questionable ways. In a society where, for the most part, mediocrity rules, they'll find a brave, bold person, sometimes a criminal, a drug dealer. So, to prevent it, the best thing we can do to keep our kids from being dragged by this kind of influence is to make them admire us for who we are. Because then your word will carry 10 times more weight than anything outside. Make them see us as a role model. Be proud to be our children. Admire us for the human beings we are. That gives our influence in their lives much more weight. So it's important that we grow out of love. Because we're going to be a role model for a lot of people. We can't help these people get lost in life. We can't drag, as the Indians say, this karma any longer. What's the best thing we can do for those we love? Do you guys know? Have you ever stopped to think about that? What's the best thing I can do for those I love? The answer is simple. It's to grow as a human being. Because only by growing as a human being do you have something solid, a solid reference to leave for them, something that will always be useful to them. Sometimes we think the best thing to leave for our kids is an apartment, I don't know, an investment with resources. Imagine what the future will be like. Nobody knows. Imagine a person who lived in Ukraine, who had an apartment, had a house, had resources, and suddenly a situation like that comes along and they have nothing left. These things, depending on historical circumstances, and we don't know what's coming, are worth nothing. They reduce to zero, reduce to dust. Now, an example of self-control, balance, generosity, and courage that you give will help them get out of a situation like that much more easily. It'll help them have clarity to get out of the most complex situations in life. So, that'll never stop being useful. Never. Well, here's an imagination exercise I'd like you all to do. Corruption, at its core, is what? A diversion of resources that should go one place but end up somewhere else. Usually a place that serves our personal interests. Isn't that right? Now let's imagine that humanity is reduced. It's our body. Imagine that oxygen is sent to our lungs and doesn't get there because a big part of the air is diverted along the way. Or imagine that food is sent to our stomach and doesn't get there because a big part of it is diverted along the way. Would a life like that be possible? Where we'd have very little air to breathe, very little food to survive, because all the resources we received were diverted along the way. Obviously, that's death. That wouldn't make any kind of life possible. We have to understand that corruption is synonymous with decomposition, with degradation. And decomposition is a characteristic of a dead body, of a corpse. A corpse decomposes, it corrupts, it degrades. Are we alive or dead, after all? Why do we let a living body get corrupted? That's ridiculous. We have to preserve our life on all levels, not just the physical one. We take care of our health so that our body doesn't get corrupted, right? We also have to take care of the psychological, moral, and spiritual levels, because that's what impacts the physical level. And it's going to determine how our life will be, after all. So, always remember that. Corruption is linked to death. It's a characteristic of a dead body, decomposing. And we're alive, and we should fight for that. Imagine the following situation, another imagination exercise. There are avalanches crashing down on houses in a village. Ice avalanches. And you think that's horrible, it's even hit your own house, you've been a victim. But every now and then, you have the habit of climbing the mountain to unwind, making little snowballs and tossing them down the mountain. And you don't realize that those little snowballs keep rolling, and down below they turn into the avalanche that buries your house. So notice what a curious situation this is. You're the culprit up there, the author, and the victim down below. And you don't realize it. And you complain about the avalanche, not knowing you're one of the ones who caused it. We complain about the avalanche of corruption that falls on us. The avalanche of diverted resources. The avalanche of things that could have been built, done for the benefit of society, but weren't. We complain about this, and rightfully so. But we have to keep in mind that we're also the ones tossing snowballs from the top of the mountain. Every time we commit a small act of corruption, which we think is innocent and insignificant, we're tossing snowballs from the top of the mountain. Therefore, that doesn't give us the moral authority to complain about the avalanche. We're in the territory of the guilty, in the territory of the victims, simultaneously. And of course, the world isn't going to change like that. Imagine another situation, another imagination exercise. Tomorrow or the day after, your mom, you, your kid might need a hospital. And that hospital isn't going to treat you well. You know why? Because its funds were diverted by corruption. Tomorrow or the day after, your kid gets into a university. You want him to be well educated. But that university isn't going to give him the education he needs. You know why? Because its funds were diverted by corruption. In other words, we're constantly being victims of this. All the time, in a serious way, it takes precious things away from us. It can even take our lives. Sometimes people who embezzle money from a hospital, they accept that if they get that fortune, it might lead to deaths down the line. And they pay that price. Imagine the moral condition of someone who pays that price. For me to win, someone has to die. And they accept that. Imagine the moral condition of a man like that. This kind of thing starts from small acts of corruption. From the small comes the big. From the small, which keeps growing, comes the big one day. So we need to be aware that corruption reeks of death and leads to death. If you see something getting corrupted, it's something that's dead, it's disintegrating, something that's rotted. It's like food that's going bad in your fridge. You immediately throw it in the trash. It's spoiled. It doesn't have life anymore. It can't sustain life anymore. Know this. We can't let ourselves feel like we're rotting. That's too cruel to do to a being whose innermost nature is divine. We have to respect ourselves. We can't allow that. The little question I didn't ask you earlier, but it was hanging in the air. If I had the ring of Gyges in my hand, what would I do? Have you stopped to think about that? What would I do if I had the ring of Jesus in my hand? Answer that for yourself, quietly, in a corner, with complete honesty. What would I do? If we frequently complain and blame others for a behavior we also have, it's like blaming the mirror for our blemishes. That's immoral too. It's immoral for me to accuse someone of a behavior that, if I had the chance, I'd do too. If I had the ring of Gyges, would I not take anything that doesn't belong to me? Because if I take it, can I really accuse the thief? He's just bolder than I am, but I have the same tendency. So, be careful when we accuse others of something that has its seed alive within us. Be very careful with that, because at the end of the day, we haven't worked on that flaw. And it can develop, at some critical point in life, into something more serious. It still has living seeds inside us. We have to uproot those seeds and say never, not ever, under any circumstances, with no ring on our finger, never. And that's how we can demand someone to be more ethical, to not engage in corruption. If we consider a discipline called biomimicry, biomimicry is really interesting because it learns from nature to draw lessons for humans. For example, if you look at the Amazon rainforest, you'll see very diverse species. By the way, the Amazon rainforest seems to be the largest in the world in terms of biodiversity. In other words, many very different plants coexist in perfect harmony with each other. Couldn't we learn from that we're all totally different from each other, but we could also live in harmony? Is that possible? It is. In other words, I can learn from nature. And in this case here, I can learn from the nature of my own body, which is also a creation of nature. My own body, all the cells have to look out for the good of the whole, the well-being of the organism. They can't have any other goal. Each cell has to work fundamentally for the good of the organism, for its health, for the well-being of the organism. If any of them thinks differently, if any of them has some other purpose, if it wants to go solo, do something it finds pleasant just for itself, that's a tumor cell. We know it's going to lead this body to death and that it dies along with it, but it isn't aware of that. Imagine admitting to ourselves, in our conscience, that we're a tumor cell of humanity. That's just too disgraceful. Every now and then, we should look in the mirror and ask ourselves, is this who you want to be? A tumor cell. Whenever we think about corruption, we should ask ourselves that. I don't want to be a tumor cell of humanity. I want to promote life. I want to promote health, I don't want to leave that kind of mark on the world. These imagination exercises are really good for us to bring out our shine, bring out our values, and get back to our center. Don't let yourself be swayed by any appeal from society. What do we gain each day when we have an honest day? What I call the sleep of the just. An absolutely peaceful sleep. I went over my day, and today I had a day worthy of a human being. It's the most rewarding dream of all, the one that restores you the most. Why? It's a peaceful sleep with a clear conscience. That sleep of the just, we have to fight for it. We have to earn it. And one fine day, when the great sleep of the just comes, which is death, we can also face it with that peace of mind. I'm square with heaven and earth. So, my conscience is clear. I know I've already done something for the world, and I didn't let myself get corrupted. So, I'm at peace with facing this great sleep of the just, whatever comes after. Because I'm at peace with heaven and earth. So, there are two elements that have exceptional value. That peace of mind that we'll have in all the situations of our lives. Nothing will leave us that desperate. Because I know that in every situation, I did my best. I did what was expected of me. I gave my best in every situation. Whenever I was aware of any wrongdoing, I didn't do it. I never acted with the intention of engaging in any kind of corruption. That makes me feel really clean, really at ease. And happiness for a human being has a lot to do with peace of mind. Well, anyway, integrity is health, and corruption is a disease, and it's a contagious disease, like I've already told you. We influence our concessions. You see, sometimes you're on a road, the roads are packed with cars, all jammed up, and then there's this little lane on the side just for bikes. Then some wise guy goes and squeezes in there. Pretty soon, you've got a bunch of wise guys following him. It just takes one to go. In other words, we also influence for the worse. That's very common, even faster than the influence for good. Therefore, we have to keep in mind that integrity is health on psychological, moral, spiritual, and even physical levels. And corruption is a disease, and disease is contagious. Corruption smells like death. Corruption is decay. And I can't let that happen to me in this sacred space that is my conscience. That can't happen. We should work together for a world where we and our kids would love to live. In other words, think about that world now and start working to build it right away. Because if it exists in your imagination, one day it'll exist in the real world. As Plato said in his theory of ideas, everything that exists in the realm of ideas will one day be here. In other words, when you imagine this ideal world and from now on feel like a citizen of it, you start working to build it within your life, within your behavior, and in all those who are inspired by you. That has exceptional value. It has historical value. You made a difference. You added something. You left the world a little better than how you found it. In the end, heal yourself and heal the world. That's how it works. Heal yourself from corruption, absolutely, without a doubt. And that's how you do an exceptional job. You have no idea. Around the world. The world needs that. Be aware that your actions echo. Your actions influence. If you have any love for someone or something, don't want to contaminate yourself and the world in that way. We love ourselves and we love the people around us, don't want to contaminate them, don't want to poison them with something so heavy, something that can lead them to decay. Be careful with that. Heal yourself and heal the world. That's what I wanted to share with you all today. Thanks a lot to everyone and see you next time.